The dust hadn't even settled from Lillian Hayes being thrown bodily out of Morrison's general store when she realized her life in Tombstone, Arizona territory had just become impossible. It was September 1882, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she picked herself up from the dirt street, her skirts torn and her pride shattered into 1,000 pieces. Inside the store, Edgar Morrison stood with his arms crossed, his face purple with rage as he pointed a thick finger at her through the window and mouthed words she couldn't hear, but understood perfectly. Never come back. The trouble had started 3 months earlier when Lillian, 22 years old and newly widowed, had taken a job as a seamstress to support herself. Her husband Thomas had been a good man, a mine worker who died in a cave-in just 6 months after their wedding. Without family and without means, Lillian had done what any sensible woman would do. She'd found work with her hands. But in a town like Tombstone, where reputation meant everything and gossip spread faster than wildfire, even honest work could be twisted into something ugly, Mrs. Morrison, Edgar's wife, had commissioned Lillian to make her a dress for the Founders' Day celebration. Lillian had poured her heart into that dress, working late into the night by candlelight, stitching intricate patterns into the green silk that Mrs. Morrison had selected. But when the woman tried on the finished garment, she'd flown into a fury, claiming it was too tight, too loose, too everything wrong. The truth, as Lillian later discovered, was that Mrs. Morrison had gained considerable weight during the dress's creation and couldn't bear to admit it. The situation had escalated when Mrs. Morrison accused Lillian of deliberately ruining the fabric and demanded her money back plus damages. Lillian, exhausted and pushed to her limit, had made the mistake of speaking the truth aloud in the general store, surrounded by half the town's busybodies. She'd said, perhaps not as diplomatically as she should have, that the dress fit perfectly when she'd measured for it, and that she couldn't be held responsible for changes in Mrs. Morrison's figure. The gasps that followed that statement still echoed in Lillian's memory. Mrs. Morrison had fainted, or pretended to, right there by the pickle barrel. Edgar Morrison had exploded with righteous fury, declaring that no woman who insulted his wife would ever set foot in his establishment again. And since Morrison's was the only general store for 20 miles in any direction, that ban was effectively a death sentence for Lillian's ability to survive in Tombstone. Now, standing in the street with dust coating her dark hair and tears threatening to spill down her cheeks, Lillian faced the reality of her situation. Without access to the general store, she couldn't buy food, fabric, thread, lamp oil, or any of the hundreds of necessities required for daily life. She'd have to leave Tombstone, but she had barely enough money for a week's room and board, let alone a stagecoach ticket to anywhere else. That's when she heard the horse. The rider came down Allen Street at a steady pace, sitting tall in the saddle on a beautiful sorrel mare. Lillian looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, and found herself staring at a man who seemed to have ridden straight out of one of the dime novels she secretly loved to read. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting, sun-bronzed skin, and eyes the color of whiskey. He wore a dusty black hat, a blue shirt faded from many washings, and a gun belt that sat easy on his hips like it belonged there. The cowboy, and that's clearly what he was, reined in his horse right beside Lillian and dismounted in one smooth motion. Up close, she could see the concern in his eyes as he took in her disheveled appearance and the small crowd of onlookers still gathered near the general store. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and warm with a slight Texas drawl. "Are you hurt?" Lillian straightened her spine, determined not to show weakness in front of a stranger. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you." His eyes, she noticed, were remarkably kind despite the hard edge of someone who'd lived a difficult life. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but you don't look fine. You look like you've had a bad day and it's only 3 o'clock. He glanced toward Morrison's store, where Edgar still stood glowering in the doorway. "That have anything to do with old Morrison over there? "It's none of your concern," Lillian said, but her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her. The cowboy was quiet for a moment, then he took off his hat and held it against his chest in a gesture of respect. "Name's James Cordell. My friends call me Cord. I just rode in from Texas with a herd bound for California. We're resting the cattle outside town for a few days before the final push west." He paused, studying her face. "And I may be speaking out of turn, but I've got 2 older sisters back in San Antonio, and I know what it looks like when someone's been treated unfairly. So if there's anything I can do to help, I'd be obliged if you'd let me know." There was something about his straightforward manner, his genuine concern, that broke through Lillian's defenses. Maybe it was because she hadn't had a kind word spoken to her in weeks. Maybe it was because she was tired of fighting alone. Or maybe it was simply because when James Cordell looked at her, she felt seen as a person rather than as the target of town gossip. "I've been banned from the general store," she said quietly. "Forever. Over a misunderstanding about a dress I made for Mrs. Morrison." James's eyebrows rose. "That seems extreme." "Welcome to Tombstone," Lillian said with a bitter laugh, "where a woman's reputation is more fragile than spun glass and twice as easily shattered. What will you do?" "I don't know." The admission cost her, but there it was. "I suppose I'll have to leave town, though I haven't the money for it yet. Until then, I'll manage somehow." James settled his hat back on his head and regarded her with an expression she couldn't quite read. A woman can't live without supplies. "If Morrison won't serve you, how will you eat? How will you work?" I said. "I'll manage." But even as she spoke, Lillian knew it was an empty boast. "Tell you what," James said slowly, as if an idea was forming even as he spoke. "I need to stock up on supplies for my men anyway. Why don't you give me a list of what you need and I'll purchase it for you? Morrison can't refuse to sell to me, and what I do with my purchases afterward is my own business." Lillian stared at him. "You do that? For a stranger?" "Ma'am, my mama raised me to help people when they need it. Besides," and here a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, "I never did like bullies, and from what I can see, Morrison's being a bully. So yes, I do that." It was a temporary solution at best, but it was something. Lillian felt a weight lift slightly from her chest. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Cordell. I'll pay you back, of course, every cent. We can work out the details later. For now, why don't you write up that list?" Over the next hour, sitting on the bench outside the closed birdcage theater, Lillian wrote out what she needed while James listened to her story. She told him everything, from Thomas's death to the dress commission to the disastrous confrontation. James listened without interrupting, his face growing darker as the tale unfolded. "That's not right," he said when she finished. "You told the truth, and you're being punished for it while Mrs. Morrison gets to play the victim." "That's how it works here," Lillian said. "The Morrisons have money and influence. I have neither." James took the list she'd written and stood up, dusting off his pants. "Wait here. I'll be back shortly." Lillian watched him stride into Morrison's store with the confident walk of a man who knew his own worth. Through the window, she could see Edgar Morrison's obsequious smile as he greeted this new customer, a smile that would have disappeared instantly if he'd known what James was really doing. 20 minutes later, James emerged with 2 large crates of supplies. He loaded them onto his horse and then turned to Lillian. "Where are you staying?" "The boarding house on 5th Street, Mrs. Chen's place." "I know it. Let me help you carry these over." As they walked through town, Lillian was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. By tomorrow, everyone would be talking about the widow Hayes walking with a strange cowboy. But somehow, with James beside her, the gossip seemed less important. At the boarding house, James carried the crates up to her small room on the 2nd floor. It was a sparse space, just a bed, a washstand, a table by the window where she did her sewing, and a trunk containing everything she owned. James set the supplies down carefully and then turned to face her. "Miss Hayes," he began, then stopped. "I don't even know your Christian name, Lillian." "Lillian Hayes." "Miss Lillian, then. I've been thinking about your situation, and buying supplies for you every time you need them isn't a long-term solution." "I know," Lillian said quietly. "I'll have to leave Tombstone eventually. I just need a little more time to save up the fare." "What if you didn't have to leave?" James leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "What if there was another way?" "There isn't. Morrison made it clear I'm not welcome in his store, and without access to supplies, I can't stay here." "Morrison's store isn't the only general store that could exist in Tombstone." James said it casually, but there was something in his eyes that made Lillian's heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been looking for a reason to settle down. I've been driving cattle for 6 years now, ever since I was 21, and I'm tired of the trail. I've saved up a good amount of money, and I've been wondering what to do with it." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "What if I bought Morrison's store?" Lillian's breath caught in her throat. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. Morrison's been trying to sell that store for the last 2 years. My trail boss mentioned it when we rode in. Morrison wants to move to San Francisco, set his wife up in a fancy house there. He's been asking $8,000 for the property, the building, and all the stock. I've got nearly $10,000 saved up from my years on the trail." "But you don't know anything about running a store," Lillian protested, even as hope began to bloom in her chest. "I can learn. And more importantly," James said, his voice softening, "I can make sure that everyone is welcome there, including you, especially you." "Why would you do this?" Lillian whispered. "You don't even know me." James was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was almost hesitant, as if he was revealing something important. "When I saw you standing in that street today, dusty and hurt but refusing to cry, refusing to give up, I saw someone worth knowing, someone worth helping. And maybe I'm a fool, but I'd like the chance to get to know you better, Miss Lillian. I can't do that if you're forced to leave town." Lillian's heart was pounding so hard she was certain James could hear it. "That's a lot of money to spend just to get to know someone." "It's an investment in my future," James replied. "In a lot of ways. I need to settle down somewhere, and Tombstone's as good as anywhere, better than most, actually. And if buying that store means you get to stay, well, that's just good business sense. A town should take care of all its people, not just the ones with the loudest voices." The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind. James met with Edgar Morrison, and after some hard negotiating, they agreed on a price of $7,500 for the store, the building, and all its contents. Morrison, eager to finally escape to California with his wife, practically threw the deed at James once the money was counted out. Lillian watched the transaction from across the street, hardly daring to believe it was real. But it was real. On September 15, 1882, James Cordell became the owner of what had been Morrison's general store, and his first act as proprietor was to tear down the hand-painted sign above the door and commission a new one that simply read, "Cordell's Mercantile, all welcome." The second thing he did was walk across the street to where Lillian stood watching and offer her his arm. "Miss Lillian, would you do me the honor of being my first customer?" Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. "I would be delighted, Mr. Cordell." They walked into the store together, and James made a great show of helping her select fabric, thread, lamp oil, and all the other supplies she needed. When she tried to pay, he waved her money away. "First customer gets everything free, store policy." "That's a terrible business policy," Lillian said, laughing through her tears. "Then it's a good thing I'm making new policies." James grinned at her, and Lillian felt something shift in her chest, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the Arizona heat. Word spread through Tombstone faster than a summer storm. The Cowboy had bought Morrison's store. The widow Hayes was welcome again. Some people, friends of the Morrisons, swore they'd never shop at Cordell's. But most people, practical folks who cared more about fair prices and good service than social politics, came to see what the new owner was like. They found James to be friendly, fair, and knowledgeable despite his claims of inexperience. What he didn't know, he asked about. What he couldn't answer, he promised to find out. And slowly, steadily, Cordell's Mercantile became the heart of Tombstone's commercial district. James hired 2 young men to help him with the heavy work, freeing him to learn the business side of things. He spent his evenings going over ledgers and inventory lists, teaching himself accounting and supply management. And whenever he had a spare moment, he found himself looking for excuses to visit Lillian. It started innocently enough. He'd stop by her boarding house to ask her advice about fabric, since she knew textiles better than anyone. Or he'd invite her to the store to help him arrange the dry goods section, since she had an eye for organization. But soon, they both knew these were just excuses to spend time together. One evening in early October, as the desert air finally began to cool, James knocked on Lillian's door with a basket over his arm. "I was wondering," he said when she answered, "if you might like to have supper with me. Nothing fancy, just some cold chicken and bread and cheese. But there's a nice spot up on the hill overlooking town, and the sunset should be beautiful tonight." Lillian knew she should say no. People were already talking about how much time they spent together. A woman in mourning, even for a husband dead nearly a year, was expected to be more circumspect. But when she looked at James, at the hope in his eyes and the careful way he held himself as if bracing for rejection, she found she couldn't refuse. "I'd like that very much," she said. They walked up the hill as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep rose. James spread a blanket on the ground and they sat together, sharing the simple meal and talking about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up in Texas, about his parents' small ranch and his 2 sisters, both now married with children. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about the cholera epidemic that had taken her parents when she was 16, about meeting Thomas at a church social and marrying him perhaps too quickly, out of loneliness rather than deep love. "That sounds sad," James said quietly. "It was and it wasn't," Lillian replied. "Thomas was kind. He didn't deserve to die so young, but I'd be lying if I said ours was a great romance. We were 2 lonely people who found comfort in each other. That's not nothing, but it's not everything either." "What would everything be?" James asked, and there was something in his voice that made Lillian look at him sharply. "I don't know," she admitted. "I used to think it was just kindness and stability, but lately I've been wondering if there might be more. If there might be someone who makes your heart beat faster, who makes you want to be better, who sees you for who you really are and loves you anyway." James set down his tin cup and turned to face her fully. The last rays of sunlight caught in his dark hair, turning it bronze at the edges. "Lillian," he said, dropping the formal miss, "I need to tell you something." Her heart was suddenly pounding. "What?" "I didn't buy that store just as a business investment. I didn't even buy it primarily to help you, though that was part of it." He took a deep breath. "I bought it because from the moment I saw you in that street, dusty and defiant and absolutely beautiful, I knew I'd found someone special. Someone I wanted to know better. Someone I wanted to build a life with." "James," Lillian whispered, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish, please. I know this is fast. I know you barely know me. I know you're still in mourning and that the proper thing would be to wait and court you slowly and carefully. But I'm not a patient man, Lillian, and life's too short to pretend I don't feel what I feel. I'm falling in love with you. I might already be in love with you, and I needed you to know that." Lillian's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "You spent $7,500 because you were falling in love with me. Best money I ever spent," James said firmly. "Even if you tell me right now that you don't feel the same way, even if you tell me we can only be friends, it was worth it to see you smile again. To know you're safe and provided for, to know you have a place where you're welcome." "You're absolutely insane," Lillian said, but there was no heat in it. "Completely, utterly mad." "Probably," James agreed. "Is that a problem?" Instead of answering, Lillian leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and sweet and tasted like sunset and new beginnings. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and James's eyes had gone dark with emotion. "I'm falling in love with you too," Lillian whispered. "I didn't think I could, not again, not so soon, but you make me feel alive in a way I've never felt before." Like I'm not just surviving, but actually living. James cupped her face in his hands, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Then let's live together. Marry me, Lillian. I know it's fast, I know it's crazy, but marry me anyway. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy. People will talk, Lillian said, but she was already nodding. Let them talk. When have you ever cared what people thought? James kissed her again, deeper this time, sealing the promise. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church on Allen Street. James's trail boss and crew came into town for the wedding, forming a rough but enthusiastic congregation. Mrs. Chen from the boarding house stood up with Lillian, and one of James's hired hands stood up with him. The preacher, a kind man named Reverend Tombstone, smiled throughout the ceremony as if he knew he was witnessing something special. When James slipped the simple gold band onto Lillian's finger and said, "I do," his voice was steady and sure. When Lillian said the same words back to him, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. They moved into the apartment above the store, a space that had been used for storage, but that James had spent 2 weeks cleaning and preparing. It wasn't large, but it had good windows that let in plenty of light, and Lillian filled it with small touches that made it home. Curtains she sewed from cheerful yellow fabric, a quilt for their bed made from scraps of her prettiest materials, wildflowers in a mason jar on the kitchen table. Their first weeks of marriage were an adjustment. James was used to living on the trail, to wide open spaces and the company of rough men. Lillian was used to being alone, to silence and solitude, but they learned each other's rhythms, their habits and preferences. James learned that Lillian sang while she sewed, old folk songs in a clear, pretty voice. Lillian learned that James read the newspaper every morning with his coffee, lips moving slightly as he sounded out the longer words. They worked together in the store, Lillian's customer service skills and eye for display complementing James's head for numbers and his natural friendliness. They made a good team, and the business thrived. Even some of the people who'd sworn never to shop there eventually returned, won over by fair prices and quality goods. Of course, not everyone was happy about their marriage. The Morrisons, now settled in San Francisco, wrote bitter letters to their friends complaining about the cowboy who'd stolen their store and married that awful woman. A few of the town's more proper matrons sniffed that Lillian hadn't observed a proper mourning period. But most people, seeing the way James and Lillian looked at each other, the way they moved together like two parts of a whole, simply smiled and wished them well. Winter came to Tombstone, such as winter was in the Arizona territory. The days were mild, the nights cold, and occasionally there was even frost on the ground in the early mornings. Business slowed as people stayed inside more, but that just gave James and Lillian more time together. They spent their evenings by the fire, Lillian sewing or mending while James read aloud from the latest newspaper or a book one of his customers had recommended. Sometimes they just talked, sharing their dreams for the future. James wanted to expand the store, maybe open a second location in a nearby town. Lillian wanted to start offering custom sewing services again, but this time on her own terms. One night in late December, as they lay in bed with the cold wind rattling the windows, Lillian turned to James with a question she'd been holding inside for weeks. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving up the trail, settling down, buying the store?" James rolled over to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "Not for a single second. Lillian, before I met you, I was just drifting. I had money but no purpose. I had work but no home. Now I have everything that matters. I have you, I have a business I'm proud of, I have a place where I belong. How could I regret that? I just worry sometimes that I trapped you into this life, that you gave up your freedom for me. You didn't trap me. I walked into this with my eyes wide open, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat." He pulled her closer, his arms warm and solid around her. The trail was never freedom, not really. It was just running from one place to another, never staying long enough to matter. This is freedom. Being with you, building something that lasts, that's what I want." Lillian buried her face in his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," James replied, kissing the top of her head. "More than I knew it was possible to love anyone. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities." A fire broke out in the building next to the store, and James and several other men fought for hours to keep it from spreading. They saved the mercantile, though the roof sustained some damage. James used the necessary repairs as an excuse to expand, adding a new section for farming equipment and tools. Lillian started advertising her sewing services again, this time with James's full support and encouragement. She was nervous at first, worried about encountering more clients like Mrs. Morrison, but word had spread about what really happened with that dress, and most of the town's women were firmly on Lillian's side. She found herself with more work than she could handle, sewing everything from simple day dresses to elaborate wedding gowns. One of her clients was a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, barely 19 and engaged to a rancher's son. Sarah was sweet and kind, and she reminded Lillian of herself at that age, full of hope and dreams for the future. When Sarah tried on her wedding dress and burst into happy tears, Lillian felt a sense of satisfaction that went deeper than professional pride. She was helping create happy memories, not just clothing. By the time their first anniversary approached in October 1883, Lillian and James's life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The store was thriving, Lillian's sewing business was booming, and they'd become respected members of the community. James had been asked to join the town council, and Lillian had been invited to help organize the church's charity bazaar. But beneath the contentment, Lillian was hiding a secret. She'd suspected for weeks, and a visit to the doctor had confirmed it. She was expecting a baby, due in early spring. She'd been trying to find the perfect moment to tell James, wanting to make the announcement special. On the evening of their anniversary, Lillian prepared a special dinner. She closed the store early, shooing James upstairs with instructions not to come down until she called him. Then she set the table with their best dishes, lit candles, and arranged everything perfectly. When James came down and saw the spread, his eyes widened. "What's all this?" "A celebration," Lillian said, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. "Of our first year together." They ate slowly, savoring the food and the company. Lillian had made all of James's favorite dishes, roast chicken and mashed potatoes and apple pie for dessert. As they finished the meal, she reached across the table and took his hand. "James, I have something to tell you." He immediately looked concerned. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Lillian assured him. "Better than perfect, I'm expecting. We're going to have a baby in March." For a moment, James just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a smile broke across his face, so wide and genuine that it made Lillian's heart sing. "A baby! We're having a baby, we are," Lillian confirmed, laughing as James jumped up from his chair and swept her into his arms, spinning her around the room. "I'm going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "We're going to be parents. Are you happy?" Lillian asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," James said. He set her down gently, as if she were suddenly made of spun glass, and placed a reverent hand on her stomach. "There's a baby in there, our baby." "There is," Lillian agreed, covering his hand with her own. The next several months were a blur of preparation and anticipation. James became comically overprotective, insisting that Lillian rest more and work less. He hired another young woman to help in the store so Lillian wouldn't have to stand for long hours. He read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could get his hands on, much to the amusement of the other men in town. Lillian, for her part, felt more alive than ever. Despite the discomforts of pregnancy, the nausea and the tiredness and the way her back ached, she glowed with happiness. She spent her spare time sewing tiny garments, little gowns and blankets and caps in soft white cotton. James helped her set up a nursery in the corner of their bedroom, building a beautiful cradle from oak wood and sanding it smooth as silk. They argued playfully about names. James wanted to name a boy after his father, Robert. Lillian wanted to name a girl after her mother, Catherine. They compromised by agreeing to use both names somehow, regardless of the baby's sex. Winter passed into early spring, and as Lillian's due date approached, James became increasingly nervous. He jumped at every sound, convinced that the baby was coming. Twice, he woke the doctor in the middle of the night for false alarms. The doctor, an elderly man named Dr. Patterson, took it all in good humor and told James that such nerves were common in first-time fathers. The real labor began on a Tuesday morning in late March 1884. Lillian woke to cramping pain and knew immediately that this was different from the false contractions she'd been having. She touched James's shoulder gently, waking him. "James, it's time." He was out of bed instantly, pulling on his clothes with shaking hands. "Are you sure? Should I get the doctor? Should I boil water? I read something about boiling water." Despite the pain, Lillian laughed. "Get the doctor." "And Mrs. Chen. And yes, boil some water, though I'm not entirely sure why." The next several hours were simultaneously the longest and shortest of Lillian's life. Dr. Patterson arrived and took charge with calm efficiency. Mrs. Chen came and held Lillian's hand, speaking soothing words in a mix of English and Cantonese. James paced outside the room, not allowed in, wearing a path in the wooden floorboards. The pain was intense, worse than anything Lillian had imagined. But every time she felt like she couldn't go on, she thought of James waiting outside, of the life they'd built together, of the family they were creating. She thought of how far she'd come from that day when she'd been thrown out of Morrison's store, dusty and hopeless. She thought of James riding into her life like a hero from a storybook and making everything possible. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Lillian gave one final push, and suddenly there was a new sound in the room, the lusty cry of a newborn baby. "It's a boy," Dr. Patterson announced, holding up the squirming, red-faced infant. "A healthy baby boy." Lillian collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and exhilarated. Mrs. Chen cleaned the baby quickly and efficiently, then placed him in Lillian's arms. He was perfect, with a cap of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus on her face. He had James's nose, she thought, and maybe her chin. "Can I get my husband?" Lillian asked weakly. Mrs. Chen smiled and went to the door. The moment she opened it, James burst through, his face pale and his eyes wild with worry. But when he saw Lillian holding the baby, his expression transformed into something approaching wonder. "Is he all right? Are you all right?" James asked, approaching the bed cautiously. "We're both fine," Lillian assured him. "Come meet your son." James sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby with an expression of absolute awe. Gently, carefully, he touched one tiny hand, and the baby's fingers immediately curled around his father's finger, gripping tight. "He's so small," James whispered. "He won't be for long," Dr. Patterson said cheerfully, packing up his instruments. "He's a good size, about 8 pounds I'd say, strong and healthy. You've got a fine boy there." After the doctor and Mrs. Chen left, giving them privacy, James and Lillian sat together, taking turns holding their son. They finally settled on a name, Robert James Cordell, after both their fathers. They would call him Bobby. "I can't believe he's ours," James said softly, cradling Bobby against his chest. "I can't believe we made this perfect little person." "He is perfect, isn't it he?" Lillian agreed, though she was biased. "He's got your chin," James said, "and I think maybe your eyes, though it's hard to tell yet." "He's got your hair," Lillian replied, "and your nose, definitely your nose." They stayed like that for hours, talking softly, marveling over every tiny detail of their son. Bobby slept peacefully, occasionally making small sounds that made his parents' hearts melt. As the moon rose and silver light filled the room, Lillian felt a sense of complete contentment settle over her. Less than 2 years ago, she'd been alone and desperate, thrown out of a store and facing an impossible future. Now she had a husband who loved her, a business that thrived, a place in the community, and a beautiful son. It seemed impossible that so much could change in so little time. "What are you thinking about?" James asked softly. "About how different everything is now," Lillian replied. "About how none of this would have happened if you hadn't ridden into town that day." "I think about that sometimes too," James admitted. "About all the small chances and coincidences that brought us together, if my trail boss had chosen a different route, if we'd camped somewhere else. If I'd ridden down a different street." "Do you believe in fate?" Lillian asked. James considered the question seriously. "I don't know about fate exactly, but I believe some people are meant to find each other. I believe that when something feels this right, this perfect, there's got to be a reason for it." "I believe that too," Lillian said. The first few months of Bobby's life were exhausting and wonderful. Lillian and James took turns walking him when he cried at night. They marveled over his first smile, his first laugh, the way he tracked them with his eyes as he grew more alert. James closed the store for a week after Bobby's birth, wanting to be there for every moment. As Bobby grew, so did the business. James hired more help, expanding Cordell's Mercantile into the adjacent building that had been repaired after the fire. He added a section for farming equipment, another for household goods, and even a small area where Lillian could sell her handmade items. Lillian cut back on her custom sewing to spend more time with Bobby, but she still took the occasional commission for special occasions. She loved the work, loved creating beautiful things, but she loved being a mother even more. The town of Tombstone continued to grow and change. The silver mines that had founded the town began to show signs of depletion, and some people talked about moving on to the next boom town. But James and Lillian had no intention of leaving. They'd built their life here, their business and their home and their family. This was where they belonged. On Bobby's first birthday, they threw a party at the store, inviting the whole town. It was a grand affair, with cake and games and presents piled high. Bobby, toddling around on unsteady legs, was the center of attention, laughing and clapping his hands at all the excitement. As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Lillian found a quiet moment with James on the front porch of the store. Bobby was asleep upstairs, worn out from all the excitement. The evening air was cool and pleasant, carrying the scent of desert sage. "Can you believe it's been a year?" Lillian asked, leaning against James's shoulder. "Feels like yesterday and forever ago at the same time," James replied, wrapping an arm around her waist. "He's growing so fast. They do, or so everyone keeps telling me." Lillian paused, then added casually, "He's going to need someone to play with eventually." James looked down at her sharply. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Lillian smiled. "I'm saying that Bobby is going to be a big brother come next spring." James let out a whoop of joy that probably woke half the neighborhood. He picked Lillian up and spun her around just like he had when she'd told him about Bobby. "Another baby. We're having another baby, we are," Lillian confirmed, laughing. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," James said, echoing his words from the first time. "I love you, Lillian Cordell. I love our life. I love our family. I love everything about our world." "I love you too," Lillian replied, and as James kissed her under the stars, she reflected on how miraculous life could be. How a single act of kindness, a cowboy buying a store to help a stranger, could transform into this. A love that deepened with every passing day, a family that brought joy beyond measure, a future bright with possibility. Their second child, a girl they named Catherine Rose, was born in April 1885. She had Lillian's fair coloring and James's whiskey-colored eyes. Bobby, now nearly 2, was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help take care of her, to bring her toys, to sing her the songs Lillian sang. Life settled into a new rhythm. The store continued to thrive, now firmly established as Tombstone's primary mercantile. James hired a manager, a competent man named William Harris, to handle the day-to-day operations so he could spend more time with his growing family. Lillian sewed less for money and more for pleasure, creating beautiful things for her children and her home. They added onto the apartment, expanding it into a proper house above and behind the store. There was room now for the children to have their own bedroom, for Lillian to have a dedicated sewing room, for James to have a small office where he could handle the business accounts. As the children grew, so did their personalities. Bobby was serious and thoughtful, always asking questions about how things worked. Catherine was adventurous and bold, climbing everything she could reach and giving her parents constant heart attacks. They were different as night and day, but they adored each other, playing together for hours with the simple toys James carved from wood or the dolls Lillian sewed from scraps. The years passed quickly, marked by birthdays and holidays, by small victories and occasional setbacks. The store weathered an economic downturn when the mines began to fail. James adapted, focusing more on farming supplies and everyday necessities rather than luxury goods. They made it through, leaner but still strong. In the summer of 1888, when Bobby was 4 and Catherine was 3, tragedy struck the town in the form of a scarlet fever outbreak. Dozens fell ill and several children died. Lillian and James kept their children home, terrified of losing them. Bobby caught a mild case but recovered quickly. Catherine never got sick at all. They felt incredibly lucky, even as they mourned with neighbors who weren't as fortunate. The scare made them appreciate what they had even more. James began closing the store on Sundays, something unheard of in a town like Tombstone. But he insisted that family time was more important than money, that his children would only be young once. They spent those Sundays together, sometimes at home, sometimes on picnics in the hills surrounding the town. They went to church in the morning, then spent the afternoon playing games, reading stories, or just being together. Those Sundays became sacred time, a tradition that would continue for years. In 1890, Lillian discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was harder than the first two, and Dr. Patterson prescribed rest. James hired help for the house, a kind Mexican woman named Rosa who took over the cooking and cleaning so Lillian could stay off her feet. Their third child, another boy they named Thomas after Lillian's first husband, was born in January 1891. James had been uncertain about the name at first, worried it might be awkward, but Lillian insisted. Thomas Hayes had been a good man who deserved better than he got, and she wanted to honor his memory. James, understanding the importance of the gesture, agreed. Little Thomas was a calm, easy baby, and Bobby and Catherine were old enough now to be genuinely helpful. Bobby, at 6, was serious about his role as big brother, always making sure the baby had his blanket or his bottle. Catherine, at 5, sang to Thomas constantly, making up nonsense songs that somehow always made him smile. As the 1890s progressed, Tombstone itself began to change. The silver mines that had built the town were largely played out. Many people moved away, chasing new opportunities. The population dropped from its peak of thousands to just a few hundred stubborn souls who refused to give up on the town. James and Lillian stayed. They'd built their life here, and they weren't about to abandon it. Besides, the remaining population still needed a general store, and Cordell's Mercantile continued to serve the community faithfully. The store evolved with the times. James added a section for ranch supplies as Tombstone transitioned from a mining town to a ranching community. He started offering credit to local ranchers, a risky move that paid off as it built deep loyalty among his customers. When times were hard, James was known to forgive debts, a generosity that Lillian supported even though it sometimes meant they had to tighten their own belts. By 1895, Bobby was 11, Catherine was 10, and Thomas was 4. The older children helped in the store after school, Bobby learning the accounts and inventory while Catherine charmed customers with her bright smile and quick wit. Thomas was still too young to help much, but he loved being in the store, playing in the corner with his wooden horses while his parents worked. One evening that summer, after the children were in bed, Lillian and James sat on their porch, watching the stars come out. They'd been married for 12 years now, and if anything, their love had only deepened with time. They knew each other's moods and thoughts, could communicate with a glance, moved through their days in comfortable synchronicity. "Do you ever think about that day?" Lillian asked softly. "The day we met, all the time," James admitted. "I think about how easily we might have missed each other if I'd been a few minutes later, if you'd already left the street, if I'd been less brave about speaking to a stranger. I think about what would have happened to me if you hadn't stopped," Lillian said. "Where I'd be now, what I'd be doing." "Don't," James said, reaching over to take her hand. "Don't think about that. You're here, we're here, and that's what matters. I know. But sometimes I can't help but marvel at how much my life changed because a kind cowboy decided to help a stranger." She squeezed his hand. "You saved me, James, in every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," James replied. "I was just drifting before I met you. You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to settle down, to build something lasting. Everything good in my life flows from the day I met you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the town. Finally, Lillian spoke again. "I'm happy," she said simply. "I'm so incredibly happy. Even with all the hard times, all the struggles, I wouldn't change a single thing about our life." "Neither would I," James agreed. "Not one single thing." As the years continued to pass, Bobby grew into a serious young man with his father's head for business and his mother's kind heart. He was 13 when he announced he wanted to take over the store someday, and James couldn't have been prouder. Catherine, at 12, declared she wanted to be a teacher, inspired by the new schoolteacher who'd arrived in town. Thomas, at 6, changed his mind about his future career every other day, but that was all right. He had time. In 1897, Lillian surprised everyone, including herself, by discovering she was expecting a fourth child at the age of 37. Dr. Patterson warned that this pregnancy would be risky, given her age, and insisted on complete rest for the final months. Rosa, still with the family after all these years, took over running the household completely. Catherine, now mature at 12, helped care for Thomas and manage the home. Bobby and James ran the store, and Lillian, confined to bed rest, spent her time sewing a beautiful quilt for the new baby, each square representing a different part of their family's journey. The birth was difficult, longer and harder than any of the others. For several hours, James paced outside the bedroom, terrified he might lose Lillian. But she was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, and in the early morning hours, she delivered a healthy baby girl they named Rosemary, after Rosa, who had become like family, and after Mary, James's mother. Little Rosemary was the baby of the family, doted on by her older siblings and utterly adored by her parents. Bobby, now 14, was surprisingly gentle with her. Catherine, at 13, practiced her nurturing skills on her baby sister. And Thomas, at 7, appointed himself her official protector and entertainer. As the century drew to a close, the Cordell family was firmly established as one of Tombstone's most respected families. The store was a community institution. Lillian's sewing work, though limited now, was still sought after for special occasions. Their children were growing up strong and healthy and kind. The turn of the century in 1900 was celebrated throughout Tombstone with a huge party. James closed the store for 2 days, something almost unheard of, so the whole family could participate in the festivities. They stood together, James and Lillian and their 4 children, watching fireworks light up the desert sky, marveling at the new century stretching before them. "A new century," Lillian said wonderingly. "Can you believe it?" "I can barely believe how fast the last 18 years have gone," James replied. He was 45 now, his dark hair threaded with silver but still strong and vital. Lillian, at 40, had a few more lines around her eyes, but she was still beautiful, still the woman who'd captured his heart in a dusty street all those years ago. They stood like that for a long time, surrounded by their children, watching the celebration. Bobby was 16 now, already making plans to attend college in California before coming back to run the store. Catherine was 15, bright and ambitious, determined to get her teaching certificate. Thomas, at 9, was still figuring himself out but showed signs of being a talented artist, always drawing and painting. And little Rosemary, at 3, was a bundle of energy and joy who kept everyone on their toes. As the new century unfolded, life continued its steady rhythm. Bobby did go off to college, studying business and commerce, writing long letters home about his classes and his experiences. Catherine finished school and began training to be a teacher under Miss Anderson, the town's primary school instructor. Thomas developed his artistic talent, and Lillian encouraged him, buying him proper art supplies and framing his best work. In 1903, Bobby came home from college with a degree in business and a fiancée, a smart young woman named Alina who he'd met at school. They were married that fall in a beautiful ceremony, and Bobby and Alina moved into a house down the street. Bobby took over more and more of the store's operations, implementing new ideas and efficiencies while still maintaining the personal touch and community focus that had always defined Cordell's Mercantile. Catherine got her teaching certificate and was hired at the local school, teaching the youngest students with patience and creativity. She loved her work, came home every day with stories about her pupils and their antics. In 1905, Bobby and Alina had their first child, a boy they named James after his grandfather. James Cordell became a grandfather at 50, and he took to the role with enthusiasm, carving toys and telling stories to his grandson just as he had for his own children. Thomas, at 14, was torn between pursuing art and helping with the family business. James sat him down and told him the same thing he'd told all his children: follow your passion and success will follow. Thomas chose art and, with his parents' blessing, made plans to study in San Francisco when he turned 18. Rosemary, at 8, was still the baby, though she hated being treated like one. She was fierce and independent, insisting on doing things herself, whether it was helping in the store or learning to ride a horse. As the decade progressed, Lillian and James settled into the role of family elders with grace. They were still active, still running parts of the business, still deeply involved in their children's and grandchildren's lives. But they also made time for each other, still having dinners on the hillside where James had proposed, still holding hands while walking through town, still looking at each other with the same love that had sparked all those years ago. In 1910, on their 28th wedding anniversary, James took Lillian back to that hillside. They were older now, James 55 and Lillian 50, but the view was just as beautiful as it had been all those years ago. You remember the first time we came here? James asked, spreading out a blanket just like he had decades earlier. I remember everything about that night, Lillian replied, settling beside him. I remember thinking you were either the kindest man I'd ever met or completely insane for proposing after knowing me for less than a month. Maybe I was both, James said with a smile. But I wasn't wrong, was I? No, Lillian agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. You weren't wrong. These have been the best years of my life, James, every single one of them. Mine too, James said. He pulled something from his pocket, a small velvet box. I got you something. Lillian opened it to find a beautiful necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small pendant shaped like a heart. Inside the heart, engraved in tiny script, were the words, "All welcome." Her eyes filled with tears. James, it's beautiful. It's to remind you, he said softly, fastening it around her neck, that you bought a store and changed my life just so you'd always have a place where you were welcome. That you're always welcome in my heart, in my life, in every moment of every day. You bought the store, Lillian corrected, laughing through her tears. I was the one being helped, remember? We helped each other, James said firmly. We saved each other. We built this life together. They sat on that hill until the stars came out, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the store and the town, about the life they'd built from nothing but love and determination. They talked about the future, about the grandchildren still to come, about maybe taking a trip to San Francisco to visit Thomas when he went to study art. As they walked home through the quiet streets of Tombstone, hand in hand just like always, Lillian felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her life could have gone so differently. She could have been forced to leave Tombstone in shame, could have ended up alone and struggling in some other town. But instead, a cowboy with kind eyes and a generous heart had ridden into her life and changed everything. The years that followed were good ones. Bobby expanded the store, opening a second location in a neighboring town just as James had once dreamed. Catherine became the principal of the school, respected and admired by everyone. Thomas went to San Francisco and studied art, eventually becoming a successful painter whose work was exhibited in galleries up and down the California coast. Rosemary, as fierce and independent as ever, shocked everyone by becoming a nurse, one of the first female medical professionals in the territory. James and Lillian saw their family grow and flourish. They had 6 grandchildren by 1915, with more on the way. They watched their children build their own lives, their own families, their own dreams. And through it all, their love remained the foundation on which everything else was built. On a warm evening in June 1920, James and Lillian sat on their porch, now in their mid-60s, watching the sun set over Tombstone. The town had changed dramatically from the rough mining camp it had been when they met. It was quieter now, smaller, but still vital. And Cordell's Mercantile, now run by Bobby with help from his own children, remained at its heart. 38 years, Lillian said wonderingly. We've been married for 38 years. Best 38 years of my life, James replied, squeezing her hand. Do you remember that day? Lillian asked. The day I was thrown out of Morrison's store. Like it was yesterday, James said. I remember seeing you in that street, dusty and defiant, and thinking I'd never seen anyone so beautiful. I was a mess, Lillian protested. You were magnificent, James corrected. You still are, Lillian laughed, a sound James still loved as much as he had the first time he'd heard it. We've had a good life, haven't we? The best, James agreed. 4 wonderful children, 6 grandchildren and counting, a successful business, respect in the community. But none of that matters as much as this, as us. You're still my favorite person, Lillian. You're still the one I want to talk to at the end of every day. And you're still mine, Lillian replied. You saved my life that day, James. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything, James said. That's what love is, isn't it? Finding someone who makes you better, who makes life worth living, who stands beside you through everything. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear, James and Lillian sat together in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, hearts still beating in the same rhythm they had found all those years ago. They had built a life from nothing, created a family from love, turned a moment of kindness into a lifetime of happiness. The story of how a cowboy bought a general store to help a banned widow had become legend in Tombstone, told and retold until it took on the quality of a fairy tale. But to James and Lillian, it wasn't a legend. It was simply their truth, the foundation of everything they'd become. They'd grown old together, weathered storms together, celebrated victories together. They'd raised children who were kind and capable, who carried their values into the next generation. They'd built something that would last long after they were gone. Not just a business, but a legacy of compassion, of standing up for what was right, of helping those who needed it. As they sat on their porch that evening, surrounded by the life they'd built, James and Lillian Cordell knew they had found something rare and precious. A love that had started with a single act of courage and kindness, and had grown into something that would echo through generations. They had found their home, their purpose, and their happiness in each other. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The general store that had once banned Lillian now bore the Cordell name, a symbol of welcome and community that would serve Tombstone for decades to come. And at its heart, guiding its spirit even as they grew older, were two people who had proved that love, kindness, and courage could transform everything. They had taken a moment of injustice and turned it into a lifetime of joy. They had found each other in the dust and dirt of a wild west town, and together, they had built something beautiful.